All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's seminar. We have one of our colleagues here with us, Vinsel, who is going to present his work with us. So Lee is an associate professor in the Virginia Tech STS department and the creator and host of Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. He's the author of 2 books.
They can't hear you on Zoom.
Oh.
They can now.
They can?
They can now.
All right. He's the author of 2 books, Moving Violations, Automobiles, Experts, and Regulations in the United States, and with Andrew Russell, The Innovation Delusion, How Our Obsession with the New Has Disrupted the Work That Matters Most. Also with Russell, Vinsel co-founded The Maintainers, a global research and practice network interested in the concept of maintenance, infrastructure, repair, and the myriad forms of labor and expertise that sustains our human-built world. Today, he'll be talking to us about his current book project, A Good History of Shit Jobs, which drew directly out of his work on The Maintainers. Over to you, Lee.
Thanks so much for having me, John. It's wonderful to be here in the seminar of my own department. And before I get going, I wanted to say 4 quick things. The first thing is I just wanted to thank the Athenaeum crew who always makes our streams so wonderful. In the far back is Graham, who does all kinds of tech wizardy things and is controlling sound right now. And he also is the lead guitarist and singer in a wonderful death metal band called Brain Sludge, which you should definitely check out if you get a chance. And in front of him is Mandy Lamb, who is the most knowledgeable person about Blacksburg that I know. I love you, Lambo. And this is Joe Ford up here, who's the head of the Athenaeum and is also my best friend in Blacksburg. So I just wanted to thank them all for all the hard work they do. The second thing yep.
They have a lot of static on Zoom. It comes and goes.
Good. Thank you for doing that, Cora. Good. It could be because I'm loud.
They said it happened last week, too.
Oh, okay. Joe, do you want me to give you test, or what do you want?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. All right, should I keep going? All right. The second thing I wanted to say is that I know that these are hard, stressful, and scary times for lots of people, and many of my friends are not doing so great right now. So if you are in that position, I just want to say that my heart goes out to you, and may you be well, and may your loved ones be well too. I also wanted to affirm, this is especially for the graduate students, but not exclusively, that this is a community that has a lot of love in it. So if you are feeling like you need support, I am here for you, but I am not in any way unique. There's lots of people who are very loving in our community, including Saul and Cora and John and so many others. So if you need something, please reach out to people. And the fourth thing I wanted to say is that one way we can support each other is simply to be together, by being together. And so if you can, I would really appreciate you to really strongly encourage you to come to the happy hour that's going to happen after my talk. So it was about 8 years ago that I interviewed for the job I have now. And there's still a part of me that wants to say that I'm new here, but that's just because I listened to too much David Bowie in high school, so it's just like left a mark. And I think there's a sense in which, even though we work together, do we really know each other in some ways, right? So today I want to tell you about my current book project, which is called A Good History of Shit Jobs, in a kind of casual way. And I'm going to tell you what I'm up to with it and what I'll be working on this fall when I'm on the first sabbatical of my career. And I'll give you a sense of the current plan for the overall project, what the book is supposed to look like. I'll dive into one historical example of something I've done research on, which is how the Clinton administration, especially Secretary of Labor Robert Reich, thought about human capital policy during what was called the new economy of the 1990s. And I will also tell you a little bit about myself and why I care so deeply about this topic that I've come to write about. So a little over 5 years ago, about 5 years ago, I published this book, The Innovation Delusion, How Our Obsession with the New Has Disrupted the Work That Matters Most, with my good friend Andy Russell. This talk is not about that book. when I was doing research for that book, Andy and I got contacted by this woman named Stephanie Hoops, who runs a program at United Way called United for Alice. And they have come up, I could go into their methodology later if you're interested. They have come up with a measure of financial hardship in the United States that finds that working at the county level, they find that about 40% of American households struggle to make ends meet. And that became a part of the innovation delusion. It's in there. But it really began taking over my mind in a sense. I was just like, why is this the case that so many people, including I will go into later, so many working households can't afford to make ends meet? And so I decided to write a book about it. My hypothesis is that it's because the American economy is full of poorly paid, poorly benefited, what I call shit jobs. And that's what I mean by shit job. It's poorly paid and poorly benefited. So why is that? And I think we see the reality of this 40% in so many different places. The kind of diseases people get, the chronic diseases, crises of housing. We can just keep going on and on and on about all the places we see the rampant financial hardship in our nation playing out. One place I think we're starting to see it play out is in our politics. So you might have seen that in this last presidential election, people who made under $50,000 went for Trump, and people who made more than $100,000, this is the first time in history this happened, went for the Dems, okay? And you also know that people with college degrees have tended to vote Democrat, and people without have tended to vote Republican. So I think this is one, I'm going to say, this is, I think, one place where we're starting to see the politics of this mass hardship play out. I mean, one strong way to put this is, if you are in the room with me right now or on the stream, there is a very good chance that your beliefs and predilections and such mirror the elites and privileged more than they mirror what we used to call the working class, okay? And what does that mean? So, I decided to write a book about why I think that is the case. Some people don't like the title. Usually, they get it confused with David Graeber's bullshit jobs, and there's a whole thing. My literary agent, Lauren Sharp, who is very sharp, gave me the title as a working title, and it's been extremely helpful as a way to collect my thoughts and work. Is it going to be the title when it comes out? I don't know, because the trade press I will end up going with will pick the title, and I just don't care about titles. So I'm just setting this up that if you want to talk to me about the title, I'm going to take your information down and give it to my future editor, and you guys can have a conversation about it. This is from a LinkedIn post from a business historian who got kind of triggered by it. It says, "It would be tough to take the author seriously with the title chosen for their project." I love the last sentence, though. "Hate to be tough on you, but we need business historians do outstanding scholarship every time, especially if they want the business management to learn from them." I'm like, wow, okay. Maybe. And I actually think this is, I think business managers often have a sense of humor and irony. So I think this is selling business management short, obviously. All right, so, one question is, why do I care about this subject? And I thought I would tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and when I was 5 or 6 years old, my family moved to Joliet, Illinois. And if you know Joliet, Illinois, it's probably mostly because it is where the movie Blues Brothers begins, where Joliet Jake comes out of Joliet prison and meets his brother Elwood. And Elwood is a local farming community right next to Joliet, where my parents now live, actually. So this is why Joliet's most famous in kind of pop culture. But for most of the 20th century, it was the home of the second largest steel mill in the nation. It was a United Steel plant, and it closed down in the late 70s and early 80s. And by by 1981, like 30% of the population was unemployed. In the 1990s, the city opened up gambling boats. They had gamblings open up, hoping to draw in tourism dollars. That was the way they were going to replace industry, was with tourism. And of course, we not only had Joliet prison, we also had Stateville. So I used to say that the core industries of my hometown were prisons and gambling boats for a while. And by the way, this panopticon in Stateville, it's either the panopticon in Joliet or the panopticon in Stateville that is featured in Foucault's Discipline and Punish. So I've always been very proud of my hometown for being in that important philosophical work. And then when I went to college, what happened is this place called Centerpoint opened up, which is the largest, it's called the largest inland port in America. And so what it is, it's trains come from basically the West Coast full of stuff from abroad that's made abroad. And then it's unloaded on the tractor trailers there and goes out to, everywhere, stores, Target. And it's become a place just full of miles and miles of warehouses. So my hometown is a place that started as like a steel town. It went through this kind of gambling boat moment, and now it's become a place where stuff from abroad is imported to be distributed around. And the largest employer in my hometown today is Amazon because of the warehouses. My intellectual and political identity was forged in this place. This is Joliet Central High School. It's a large inner city high school. It had about 2,000 students when I was there, and it was 1/3 white, 1/3 black, and 1/3 Latino. It was a very diverse place. I learned a lot from just being there. And actually, I will say that I came to believe that diversity is a value in itself that is worth fighting for, including by using our institutions to increase it. I'll say that, yes. And so, you might wonder why I have a tie on. I think it was because I was into 9 Inch Nails. It's like a kind of industrial kid thing. I didn't wear makeup. I wasn't goth, but I was close. I was goth. I was a goth neighbor, you know? I began thinking through this movie, Clueless, starring Alicia Silverstone. I watched it when I was on vacation with my family in Florida. And we went to Florida so that my sisters, who were much younger, could go to Disney World. I did not want to be in Disney World. I wanted to be at home in my Ford Country Car station wagon with fake wood trim, making out with my girlfriend probably. I did not want to be in Florida when we watched Clueless. But there was the Paul Rudd character who I identified with extremely hard because he was so cool. I mean, he dressed in black and all these things. He wore sunglasses. By the poolside, he was reading a book. And I went back to my high school English teacher, Mr. Wilson, who was this very interesting gay Buddhist guy who lived in Chicago and would commute down to Joliet. I was like, who's this? And then I would, Nietzsche guy, you know? And Mr. Wilson was a kind and supportive teacher, so he went and photocopied an encyclopedia article on Nietzsche. And then I went and started reading Nietzsche, and I studied at the University of Barnes & Noble, which used to actually have a philosophy section. And I started reading Nietzsche and the existentialists, and then I started studying Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And by the summer of between my junior and senior year of high school, I was really into Deleuze and Foucault and Derrida. I'd really gotten into French post-structuralism. And one of my high school English teachers said, you're so into this philosophy stuff, maybe you should major in it. And then within 20 seconds, I decided I wanted to be a professor because these French dudes were professors. And the first thing I wrote about philosophically is a statue that's very kind of famous in the history of technology I learned later. It was created by the interesting female sculptor Louise Lentz Woodruff for the 1933 World's Fair, A Century of Progress. The statue was called Science Advancing Mankind. And the World's Fair took it as its motto, science finds, industry applies, man conforms. After the World's Fair, the statue was moved to my high school, where after a student contest, it was named in honor of the city's core industry. It was called the Steelman and it became our high school mascot. But by the time my peers and I walked through the halls in the 1990s, the steel industry was gone, and the idea that science and technology would offer us salvation was an empty promise. It really felt like a lie. And so, having loaded up lots of Derrida in my bong and God knows what else I was into at the time, I attempted what I considered to be a Heideggerian deconstruction of my high school mascot. I was the co-editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper, and I created this goofy, it was called The Age of Reason. It was tongue-in-cheek, and it was also an allusion to a Jean-Paul Sartre novel. But you can see I'm like looking up in the air as I'm like, oh. So there's always this kind of like tongue-in-cheek irony to everything, right? And you could ask my therapist why that's the case. And she probably had pretty good theories, I would guess. But what I said in this, I didn't know the term technological determinism yet, but that's what I went after in this article. I wrote, for example, the improvement of mankind seems to be implied in the nature of the statue, but who is to say what improvement for mankind is? So this is like the classic who STS question, right? And 22 years later, when I published this book, and I was, a central part of the book is the critique of what Andy and I call innovation speak, which is all the ways that technological change and innovation are overpromised in our culture and don't deliver in all these ways and distract us and do all these things that aren't so hot. It was really kind of a continuation of what I'd been up to. In a way, what I want to say is that in a lot of ways, I see my life as what I do in life as trying to express what Joliet taught me, right? And that I've learned a lot of things over the years, but nothing taught me as much as my hometown did. So that's a little peek into why, one of the reasons why I want to write this book. When I've traveled around the nation and moved in my itinerant life as an academic, I found poverty not just in my hometown, but everywhere I went, including right here in Appalachia, right? And so that's why I wanted to write this book, A History of the United States from the 1970s to the present, that attempts to answer the question, why is it that about 30% of working American households can barely afford to make ends meet? Now, I've given you two numbers. 40% of American households can barely afford to make ends meet. Why am I focusing on this working number? And I can tell you later, it has to do with how much has been written about the lack of a welfare state in the United States. We have a very rich literature on that. And also, that is Alice's focus, is on the working poor, you might say. And so I'm writing the book in order to support their efforts. My approach is rooted in traditions of political economy with a special focus on the relationships between technologies, firms, governance, and economic change. There's like two of my current intellectual heroes, Helen Thompson. I love her book Disorder, but even more, I love her book or her podcast These Times is an amazing resource of geopolitical and historical analysis. I also love Adam Tooze's work, and I think he's a real hero for kind of meshing economic history with intellectual history, including stuff like even being influenced by Latour and stuff like that. So I have I'm a historian, so I'm kind of a multifactorial explainer just by nature. That's just how we do things. So the question is, what's causing this? Is it globalization and deindustrialization? Is it technological stagnation? Is it technological change? Is it the rise of the service sector? I think it's all of these things and more, actually. And so part of the trick of a narrative is how to mesh all these different causes that are leading to this thing that we see, this economic hardship. Now, a lot of times when I talk about this project, people say, where's the technology in the story? Because you're like the technology guy, And I say, first of all, I want to say, how dare you stereotype me like that? That's just terrible. But also, there's a lot of technology in this story. And in some ways, technology's there. I mean, first of all, I think we have to think about the word technology. And thankfully, we have Eric Schatzberg's great history of that term. But technology is a word that really only takes off in the post-World War II period, even though there is, even in writing in English that comes out in the 20s and 30s and maybe even before, like in Veblen and Lewis Mumford and people like that. It's really a term that takes off at a popular level after World War II. And it's so caught up in that post-World War vision of economic growth and abundance. That's really why so much of the chatter was happening. And so part of it is that I am interested in technological change and how it affects the different parts of the story I'm examining. But I also am very interested in how technology has been overpromised, in that way of going back to my early deconstruction of the Steelman statue. I am also interested in, again, real economic measures of economic change and technology. So these are total factor productivity measurements from Robert Gordon's book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And what it shows you is that the highest period of total factor productivity, which is a proxy measure for technological change, is between 1920 and 1970. That you have then the 70s hit and the things slow down. And then you have this period in the 90s where it goes back up. That's what is called the new economy, and I'll be talking more about that later. And then, although this chart cuts off in 2014, this low productivity growth has been true all the way up to the present, basically, with a couple exceptions. Which is to say that we live in this time of intense technological hype about how radical the technological change is, and yet it doesn't show up in many classic measures of economic change that we have. So part of it is that we also have a sense of stagnation and decline that kind of covers this whole period. I'm very interested in those kind of discourses of that we're not moving. A couple other things about technology. Part of there's something called the Solow productivity paradox in economics, which is, in 88 or 89, the economist Robert Solow says, we see computers everywhere in our economy except for in the productivity statistics. And then that becomes a big mystery in the economics of technology, is why we're not getting more economic change from computing. And I think that's a big part of the story too, is that we've had these technologies that are supposed to be so radically transformative, and yet they don't show up. So we have to account for that. I think there's a period of a lot of hype around technological change. We've had many recurrent asset bubbles around technology, from the dot-com bust to the 2010s bubble to our generative AI bubble of the moment. We also have lots of criti-hype, so what I call criti-hype, which is like saying technological change is going to be really radical, but it's going to be dark, which we see so much of that around like generative AI right now and stuff. We have a lot of that going on. And yeah, so I think technology is there, but it's not, if you're expecting me to write like a history of the car in this book, that's not what I'm up to in this book. All right, my approach. So I keep coming back to this in my teaching and my talking on the podcast, is I think we have to be aware of two levels when we're doing historical and political economy and materialist analysis. On the one hand, there's the level of ideas and discourse and all this kind of stuff. And then on another level, and if you don't want to think about it in levels and you want to be Latourian about it, I don't care about that. That's not it. At the other level, you have actual material change, including how much money people have in their pockets and what they can afford with that money and whether they have a home over their heads, all that kind of stuff, okay? And I could do rants about this for a long time. I could just stop here and just rant for an hour and then walk out the door, and that would be my talk. But I think too often in STS, and lots of kinds of STS, we're getting stuck at the discourse level, okay? And so this is not just a history of ideas I'm doing, it's also a history of the economic change happening. I want to talk about notes on the use of the word, the N word. In this case, it's neoliberalism. And what I've decided, this is drawing on my friend Micah Roos from the sociology department, is I was talking to Micah, who's a sociologist of belief, basically, and he was saying, I was asking, like, when it comes to why people believe things the way they do, you draw on the psychological theory of motivated reasoning or confirmation bias. And he said the problem with that theory in my area is that if you draw on it, you start explaining everything through it. I've decided that this is the biggest problem with the word neoliberalism, is that it just kind of, we've used it to explain everything. And so like Micah, I'm only turning to theories of neoliberalism when I feel like I have to. Like that's the only explanation available. I'll also say that another problem with the way we use neoliberalism is that it's really like a slur, right? In a lot of circles, we just use it to mean I hate that shit or something like that, right? And so I think that we have to be realistic about that and try to uncover the kinds of actors categories that the people we're writing about actually use to describe what they're up to and think about what they're doing. So, I mean, part of what I'm up to maybe is something like, I don't want to say nonpartisan is too strong, but I really want to be able to write about conservatives in my story in a way where they feel I'm being fair to the way they think about them. So that doesn't mean we're going to agree. We're not going to agree on a lot of stuff. But I want to be able to reconstruct how they thought about the world in ways that they feel actually represents how they think about themselves. So like when we really get down to method, what is my method in a synthetic history, right? I am doing primary source research, but it's also just reading a bunch of other histories on different topics of our time and drawing it together. So what's my method? The way I think about this involves kind of like the hermeneutic circle, if we wanted to go there, but we won't go there. I have a story about the world, okay? Among other places, the story I have about what I think happened is contained in my, the kind of chapter outline in my proposal. I've written out a basic version of the story. Then what I do is I go into, most of the factors or chapters you're going to see are kind of based around factors that I think explain it. And then what I do is I read both primary sources and all the histories I can on the topic, and I see if my interpretation fits or not, or if I have to rejigger things. And believe me, I learn a lot. A lot of times I have theories, and then I go and read sources, and I find out, no, this is too simple. I could give you a concrete example. One of the theories I'm very interested in about this period is Robert Brenner, the Marxist historian, believes that profitability rates of corporations start going down in the 1970s, and that explained a bunch of corporate action in the 80s of restructuring corporations. I've always thought that sounds right, and I built it in. I still think it sounds right, but there's recent research really pushing back on him, hard on him, and so now I'm kind of like upended. You know, I actually have to do more homework. And if I decide that I can't decide one way or another, I just write about it as if here is a controversy about this thing. Okay? Historians. There are some factors that I'm going to treat primarily as background and not do individual chapters about. And it's not because they're less important, it's because they're so important in a sense. Sometimes I've played with having chapters about some of these. Ever increasing numbers of women in the workforce and dual income households. I'm especially interested in part drawing on some work by David Warren Sabian, thinking about how dual income households end up shaping the consumption of services. So like one picture is that you have dual income households who are professionals who are basically relying on people getting paid very little to do a lot of the work that used to take place in the home. Okay? There's also shifts in marriage patterns and what's called now been called the two-parent privilege, where the families that are staying together and where kids have two parents are mostly the privileged people who have stable income. There's also the issue of an aging population, which is important to the story. And then shifting patterns of immigration, both high skill and low skill. I hate those terms, but this is very much a part of the discourse. You could see how like Musk and these guys really want H-1B visas to keep coming in because the tech industries. But then there's another whole thing about low skill stuff like food pickers, and so we have to attend to both. All right, so playing with the structure of the book. All right, so there'll be some kind of introduction. I was going to do some kind of deep historical thing about what we know about work in the 20th century up until the 70s. My literary agent told me that's the most boring way possible to begin a book, and it's how every historian wants to begin a book. So we'll see. That might not happen, right? Something will stand in for an intro. Then I'm going to write about plant closures and deindustrialization. I almost don't want to start this way because I think this story can get easily overplayed, but it really lines up with my timeline, is that the first way you get a lot of reflection in the United States about like technological stagnation, industrial decline, is this late 70s moment, partly caused by the Volcker shock and monetary policy that sends a bunch of plants into closure. Then there's a couple places in the book where I really want to burrow into some individual communities. So I want to go even further. There will also already be minority people in the chapter before this, but I want to go even deeper into how plant closures affected black communities. So I think this is a very important part of the story of black poverty in the United States in many places, especially the industrial North. One of the characters I'm writing about is Barack Obama's early community organization work in Chicago, which was focused on helping black people who had been let go of jobs that were shut down from plants. This is also William Julius Wilson and lots of other people, theorists of the so-called underclass and such. A lot of this is about deindustrialization in their pictures. Then I am going to have this discussion, we'll see how central Brenner is to it, of the ways in which corporations remade themselves in the 1980s and 90s. They restructured themselves in all kinds of ways. Some of it is what is now called financialization, but there's a lot more going on. You have the rise of, I can't believe I can't think of this word, like the way, McDonald's is owned locally, franchising. You have all these structures, thank you, God, brain fart. You have all these structures popping up during this period. Corporations are trying to find new ways of doing things, often in ways that frankly hurt workers, including trying to get around various kinds of controls around wages and such. Then I'll have a chapter about Walmartization and the global consumer logistics. I will have a chapter on the new economy, and I'll be talking more about the new economy later, so I don't have to say too much. But here, what I'm focused on is there was this bubble moment where there was some technological and economic change happening, but Clinton and his people around him came to believe that it was the beginning of a new revolution that was going to open up this future of prosperity. That did not happen. All right, so it's partly about the false promises of technological change. And then I'll have a chapter on how, this builds directly on the new economy chapter, about how the Democrats especially, but the Republicans too, came to focus on education as the problem, the solution to so many social problems. And all the kinds of problems that have come with that, including massive student debt and all these kinds of issues. Then I'll have a chapter on the rise of the care economy. There's so much wonderful stuff written about in this industry's rise during this period. Then I'll have a chapter on the China shock, and that is when all the kind of deindustrialization that began in the early 2000s as a result of the rise of China's massive manufacturing base. And this chapter will especially focus on places that closed down here in Appalachia during this period that I'm interested in, furniture places and some textiles, mostly furniture, and a couple other firms. And as you probably know, a famous factoid of the China shock is the counties most affected by the China shock all went Trump. Okay, Adam Tooze and others have written about that. I'll have a chapter on a kind of growing awareness of a two-tiered society. So all the books written about inequality and monopoly power during this period. The inequality itself emerges as a big theme in so many different places. Then I'll have some kind of wrap-up chapter. I have no idea where the editors will want me to stop. We'll figure that out. In the book chapter outline, I was thinking about the first Trump administration and the inauguration speech and Trump's talk about American carnage and this kind of very dark imagery that we have of so much, not just society, but our economy. But who knows what it'll end up being, in a couple years. And finally, in the epilogue, I will be covering a bunch of different people's ideas about what we can do about this across the political spectrum, from kind of Aaron Benenav's post-scarcity radical, communism to, Orrin Cass and J.D. Vance and these kind of neo-industrial policy cats. I mean, there are people across the spectrum thinking about this. Okay, I'm doing all right on time, it looks like. I'm going to go ahead and dive into an example to give you a sense of what this is going to feel like. Well, not what this feels like, but one bit of research that I've done on it looks like. And this is I'll be drawing on research that will be in the New Economy chapter, but it's also part of this article that was just accepted by the journal Science in Context. And it's called Join Us in Preparing for Tomorrow's Jobs, Robert Reich, The New Economy, and Mythic Thinking as Interventionist Knowledge. And so I start with Bill Clinton in 2001 holds a conference on the new economy. And he comes to the podium and he tells the audience gathered there that the new economy is the new economy that was coming about right there because of all these rapid economic changes and computing power and stuff like this was going to be the beginning of an economic and technological revolution that would match or beat the earlier industrial revolution. Now, he said this in 2001 at this conference a month after the dot-com bust had started. But no one had a sense of how far the market was going to fall. And actually, this term, the new economy, basically falls off a cliff face right around the moment that the dot-com bust was happening. So a lot of this term was caught up in kind of the dot-com bubble. But it was a moment of economic and technological exuberance in the 1990s that initially wasn't so focused on Silicon Valley and technological change or digital technological change, but became much more so over time. And so I focus on the writings of Robert Reich, who's, it's kind of an interesting guy to write about because he's still around. He has a huge TikTok following, like 700,000 or something, maybe more. Bananas, right? So it's kind of interesting writing about him. He, in the early 1980s, he was one of these earlier industrial policy guys when plant closures had been happening and there were all these worries about American industry and especially the threat of Japan and a little bit less West Germany and these other manufacturing powerhouses. He was one of the Democrats who was trying to articulate an alternative to Reaganism that would involve state investment in various ways in industry in order to revive American industry, basically. And he was one of the two kind of main public figures around this idea. And in the paper, I go into how that almost became the Democratic platform, but it didn't, for a variety of reasons. By the early 1990s, his thinking had started to change a bit. He wrote this book, The Work of Nations, Preparing Ourselves for 21st Century Capitalism. And in this big industry, heavy industry, like auto industry, steel and all that stuff, it started to play less of a role. He's focused on something else. And he starts writing about a new character he calls the symbolic analyst. And he writes, it includes all the problem solving, problem identifying, and strategic brokering activities in companies. They trade in the manipulation of symbols, data, words, oral and visual representations. Information technologies are present but not core in his argument there. Now, and he has a whole section calls The Rise of the Symbolic Analyst in the book. And Reich's symbolic analyst was his way of talking about ideas that conservatives called the new class, Barbara Ehrenreich and some lefties called the professional managerial class, which is a new class of knowledge workers and professionals. And it's also a way of tapping in. Reich is really bad about citing his sources he's drawing on or who his influences. He's just bad at that. But it's also his way of talking about Daniel Bell's The Post-Industrial Society and ideas of the knowledge economy that were around during that time. And Reich was friends with Bill Clinton, and they had a friendship that went back to the 1970s when they were college students. And so Reich's ideas become a part of Clinton's first presidential campaign and a part of the book that Clinton wrote with Al Gore called Putting People First, We Can All Change America. And Bob Woodward, the journalist, says that this title was a popularization of Reich's beloved human capital theory because no one wants to hear about human capital theory, right? So they put it in other language. And among other things, they promised to spend billions on education and training, which had become Reich's solution of how government could help the economy. It had shifted from investing directly in industry so much and had come to focus on human capital or developing humans to give them skills. This Reich's vision, his policy ideas, were picked up in what was called the Reemployment Act of 1994, a bill that never became law. And it was one of the two largest, no one's written about it until me, but it was one of the Clinton administration's two biggest pushes in 1994. It's this and I can't remember what the other one was. Maybe prison reform? Nah, maybe not. Anyway, this law embodied a lot of Reich's thoughts about what the economy needed. About this time, this is from a talk from December 1995, but already when he was pushing the Reemployment Act, he started giving talks around various places called the revolt of the anxious class. And the revolt of the anxious class is, the vision is there's a permanent underclass, basically. They're just screwed pretty much. There's an elite upper class of people who are really succeeding in this new economy. And there's a bunch of people who, through globalization and technological change, are being threatened. And the question is, can we get those people the skills they need to succeed in the economy? And, so then the question is like, he has this, the information technology is finally cast as a big threat to this anxious class. The question is, what is his solution to the plight of the anxious class? Skills. It's the first thing he goes to is, it's all about skills, is we have to get people skills. And, also during this period, very early 1996, he's going around saying, the most rapidly growing job categories are knowledge intensive. I'd call them symbolic analysts. Why are they growing so quickly? Because technology is generating all sorts of new possibilities. Rather, technology generates its own new jobs, and although routine jobs are being replaced, higher skilled jobs which utilize the technology for problem solving are being created at an even more rapid clip. And the problem is that the people don't have the right skills. The only people who are thriving in this new economy are people who are becoming more valuable because they are utilizing the technology to generate greater and greater value and output. All right, so this is the picture in the Reemployment Act of 1994, is that there are gaps, the economy is changing, there are these new high-skilled jobs emerging, and what we need to do is get people skills so they have them. And this is from materials that were passed around Congress in 1994. Reich, like lots of other people during this period, were really emphasizing all these technician positions. The role of the technician had become really hot. And there was this argument that that was the fastest, he told Congress that that was the fastest growing job category in America. And so that's the kind of picture of this technical, skilled class. If we can get people these skills, they can do these things. Well, there was one problem, though, and that is that a lot of this was hype thinking driven by kind of fantastic visions of technological change. And as Doug Henwood and others have shown, the fastest growing job categories in the United States during the 1990s and into the 2000s were low-paid shit jobs in things like waitressing, security guards. In fact, for almost 20 years, the fastest growing jobs in the United States were two kind of home healthcare workers. And so it connects directly to the care economy stuff. The home health worker, the home care worker as a concept emerges in the 1980s and really explodes as we start handling care in that way. So Reich, he leaves the Clinton administration close to the beginning of the second term. He writes this bitter memoir, Locked in the Cabinet, which has been called a classic in the pissed off secretary genre. But I think that even though Reich kind of left the scene, a lot of his ideas stuck around and became very central to the way the Clinton administration and Democrats were thinking about how to help poor people, and amongst other things. So there's Daniel Green's great book, The Promise of Access, which gets into the whole notion of the digital divide in the Clinton administration. And we see documents on the digital divide put out towards the end of the Clinton administration, with sections like reducing the digital divide that says African Americans and Hispanics are substantially less likely than white and Asian Americans to use the internet. And there's this vision of like, whatever the problem, including racial exclusion, the thing to do is get them the new technical skills, and then you'll have improvement, right? STEM is just over the corner, right? Matt, do you write about STEM in your, in the book a bit? I mean, it emerges around 2000 out of the NSF, maybe a bit before that, but it's right around the corner as a kind of vision, very connected to Reich's kind of high-tech stuff. Barack Obama, very much picks up this rhetoric of, education being the problem or a solution to like so many social problems in talks like this one he gave when he was a senator, called 21st Century Schools for a 21st Century Economy. And it connects to things like, lower ed, and this is Tressie McMillan Cottom's book on the rise of for-profit colleges and all of the kind of terrible debt that people have because they were promised that, schools were going to college was going to deliver for them. But sometimes it does. It does in a lot of ways. I mean, college grads still make a hell of a lot more than people who don't have those degrees. But it also is the case that the college graduate wages, at least in some periods, began plateauing in around 2005 or so, because what we're doing is producing a bunch of graduates. That doesn't mean we're producing a bunch of jobs. Okay? And so if you overproduce something, supply and demand has effects. So I wanted to, I think Reich is interesting and the people around him are interesting because so much of their thinking about what was happening in the economy and what to do about it was driven by basically a bubble. It was a technological bubble, including in the financial sense, but also in the cultural sense of enthusiasm and fears around a new technology like we're seeing around generative AI right now. But I think there's some very interesting ways that Reich, he also was very prescient at moments in his writings. And I think one place you see this is in the end of his book, The Wealth of Nations, which is the book that came to kind of shape the Clinton administration. He has two chapters called The New Community and the Politics of Secession. And in The New Community, he wrote, the hypothesis that some degree of rational calculation rather than simple delusion underlies the disengagement of symbolic analysts from the broader public is evinced by how the symbolic analyst has chosen to live. He went on, symbolic analysts are quietly seceding from the large and diverse publics in America into homogeneous enclaves, which is kind of a very, kind of classic critique of the professional managerial class from like the left and right, is that the PMC became a culture into itself, right? And in the following chapter, Reich argued that the people who are being left behind, by what I will go ahead and call the professional managerial class, can be, I quote, can be expected to resist such efforts, yet, he went on, the secession of symbolic analysts from the rest of America has proceeded calmly and quietly. After going through a number of reasons why he believed the left behind classes so far had not resisted the secession, he concluded the politics of secession are relatively peaceful because the other side lacks any political artillery. Basically, there's no way for the people who have been left behind by this economy to resist what's going on. And so, I've begun to wonder, and I should have mentioned earlier, I've been doing a really wonderful and fun reading group with Daniel Breslau. I've learned so much from Daniel in so many different ways. But I'm doing a reading group with him and my friend Eric Hounschel, the intellectual historian, about the ideas of the professional managerial class and the new class, and how to think about these things and their histories. And I've started to wonder, for example, as I watch old high school friends whose families almost certainly voted Democratic throughout their lives, but have now started to kind of tack towards Trump. I've begun to wonder if one thing that's going on, and I would say it's just one thing. I think there's all kinds of things going on. I'm a historian. I already said I think there's lots of things going on. But I've begun to wonder, if one thing that's going on is that in a sense, the people who got left behind by the Reich's system that he was worried about, they came to find what they felt like was their artillery, right? And so this is part of what Daniel and I and Eric are exploring, is that a large part of what we're seeing in the Trump administration is an attack on experts and professionals and all these kinds of things. And so in this kind of Bourdieuian self-reflexive way, where I'm at right now when I think about what's going on around us is wondering about my own story out of Joliet and how I became this guy, right? This privileged knowledge worker who's doing pretty well for himself, actually, in lots of ways. Like where I fit in that, and then where my friends back home fit in that. And that's the kind of thing I want to explore in this book. I'm going to call it Good History of Shit Jobs. And yeah, thank you so much. We can talk about anything. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for this amazing. Can you hear me?
Do we need to turn on the mic?
Yeah, it's on.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you very much for this amazing presentation. I have a question. So, how do we can define the term hype in emerging technologies in your book? What criteria, or better to say, what time frame do we need to before we can claim that this technology is hype rather than genuine or transformative?
Yeah, that's
innovation?
a wonderful question. And going back to Hegel, he said the owl of Minerva only flies at night, which is in a sense that you can only know what was hype and what was genuine looking backwards. I have lots of bets about how the generative AI bubble is a bunch of hype in a lot of ways, and I think will not last forever. But I know that I don't know the future, right? And that's kind of a central part of my understanding of how to think about things, is I just don't know. And so I tell people, like on my podcast, I say this all the time, like, it is my bet that this is a big fat bubble, right? But it's more like a betting market than knowledge. And so I think that in a sense, we can go back to the 90s and see hype, because we're not in the 1990s anymore, right? And we can see the gap between the promises and the actual material change. You need that.
This is a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a question about kind of how you ended this presentation, where you talk about how it seems some of those that have been left behind have seemingly, they think they found their artillery.
Yeah.
And I want to tie that back to an earlier point you made, and this might be a controversial question, on actual material change being the focus of what we should study instead of ideas, chatter, BS, ideology. And I think, I guess, how do I want to phrase this? Do you think that focus on ideas, chatter, ideology, and not the actual material change in material reality in academia largely, I think we've seen it at STS as well, but
yeah, it goes way beyond STS.
Yeah. Do you think that there's specific influences or forms of thought that have led to that? Should we move away from them?
Yeah.
Should we start looking at Marx, I'll say it. Like that kind of...
Sure, no, on the whole long lineages of materialist thinking, and including American versions like interest group analysis, is where I think we should be looking. definitely including Marx. I have a couple of Marx dad jokes I'll share with you later when we're talking. But I think so. So I think that a lot of it has to do with capital T theory in post-structuralism and how it was received in the United States. Foucault is very insightful and so brilliant in so many ways. I think there are deep problems in the way he theorized society, and I think he himself was not materialist, even though he always talked about being materialist. He's too idealist in a lot of ways. But then I think that here's Foucault up here, and it's like, then he comes to America and he falls off a cliff and he dies on rocks. And that's like how he gets used in academia for so much stuff. I mean, it was just, so much of it is so bad and stupid, you know? And I feel like the problem is that the way we took up Foucault, it led us to focus on discourse and all this kind of stuff in very kind of empirically weak ways and non-materialist ways. So that's my argument. I write about this in an essay I've been writing for too long on method in technology studies and why we actually need material analysis. Yeah. And I would be happy to hear other theories later. I want to debate about it. You know, let's go. Yeah.
I'm not a Marxist, so I'm going to start with that. You talked about how the answer to the employment problem was skills, and that kind of manifested itself in higher education degrees and graduates, and then we had a glut of graduates, but the number of jobs and the employment opportunities didn't match the output. What do you think about there are jobs that are needed and are created in the technology sector, and you've already talked about this. Shipbuilding is one of those areas which highly technical, requires a lot of training and skill, and doesn't necessarily require education, but obviously opportunities and maybe some apprenticeship and that sort of stuff. How do you see aligning the jobs that are available with the people who are seeking to earn enough money to make ends meet?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that you see a lot of this in the discourse around the trades and in the importance of like where they should fit in all this right now. And you know, some people are just straight up with their kids about like, you should consider the trades over college. I want to be careful with some of the discourse around that because the notion of the skills gap itself, I think, has not held up so well empirically over time. I think it's easy to oversell that idea. But Jamie, here's one place where you and I think our visions of this kind of mesh, which is that I think you build skills by doing things you want to do, right? And that includes, for instance, having a navy, right? And you decide, all right, we're going to build a bunch of ships, and then you build skills along with those things and build capacity. Now, I would argue the same thing for what some people call the Green New Deal, right? I think there are changes we should make in our society. We should do those things, and then we should grow the skills along with them. But that's different. That's government intervention in economies. It involves planning and stuff like that, right? And I like Hayek, you know? Sometimes I don't like The Road to Serfdom. That book sucks, but like Hayek has some cool ideas. I'm not like a top-down planning guy, but I think that we probably do need state action in a lot of these places to get the ball rolling, you know? Yeah.
So first, thank you for an excellent talk, but second, thank you for these grad student questions are really coming strong. I have a question about the role of globalization as a concept, but then also as something that materially manifests across this whole thing. And I know that you're framing this in a kind of like the messages to Americans or to like people concerned with the nation. Yep. But I'm just structurally, as you're trying to put together the chapters, how do you engage with the concept of globalization, which of course in the 90s was like the thing, and then of obviously points to some phenomena that are not just facing the United States and sort of how Clinton responds to it, but are kind of broader. So I'll just leave it at that.
No. I mean, that's a great question, Matt. First of all, I think that like a lot of people, there will be a lot of this book that feels like a US and the world story, is how some people frame it, right? Because I think you have to be really real about what's happening in Japan and West Germany and Korea, the Asian tigers, so-called, and all these things. I think you really have to attend to that. And then, you know, it comes in throughout the chapters, like the deindustrialization story is partly about that, but also The Walmart story is like this global supply chain stuff and how my hometown becomes this warehouse town. So it's there, and I think that two other things I'll say is there's also, and there'll probably be in the new economy chapter, but somewhere I will deal with like the battle for Seattle and the kind of anti-globalization movement, like Naomi Klein and that kind of stuff. And then there's the kind of intellectual history of the notion of globalization, which is everywhere, right? But that's just homework I haven't done yet. But that's, yeah, but you have more thoughts. So
I just want.
well, is the microphone there? Oh, yeah.
Just a really quick practical question. How does the demographics of Juliet change from deindustrialization till now? And that
Yeah.
might be a way to bring in the immigration. Like, has
Totally.
it become much more diverse and literally as a process of globalization on that side?
Yeah, so I have had a chapter called that keeps coming in and out of the chapter outline called "Who is Doing the Work?" And yeah, I just went and drove around my hometown. My parents gave my family a minivan. It's a seafoam green vehicle. My masculinity just feels intense when I'm in that thing. It's such an amazing car, you know. But anyway, we flew to Illinois to pick it up, and I drove around my hometown for the first time in a while. And yeah, all the neighborhoods where my friends used to live are now Latino neighborhoods, like where I and my friends live. So I think that that's right. I mean, there's been a massive shift in that direction in that part. And you know, it's just like, and obviously when you think about the politics of Trumpism and all this other stuff, like the immigration story is so central. But even, you know, Democrats have made a rightward turn on that topic too. So it's big. Whether that means it deserves its own chapter and that's the way to deal with it is, I don't know. I'll see as I go along. But yeah, I think it's really important. And by the way, I'm you know, I'll just put my cards on the table. I think most of the research shows that immigration helps economies, especially aging ones. So, you know, I'm kind of a pro-immigration guy, but like, you know, I think we have to be very real about the politics of this stuff, and that, you know, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable for all kinds of reasons. So we have to attend to that. Yeah.
So Lee, I have my own question, but Rebecca also has a question that came in
Okay.
on Zoom. So we'll go me, Yen,
No,
Rebecca.
wait, I'm not ready for that. Go, Cora.
No. I was going to say me, Yen, and then you, Rebecca. So my question is really about the connection between material and discursive, and especially in this moment where we have an administration with a list of no-no words,
Yeah.
right? And how is that no-no word tied up to this perception of artillery?
Artillery?
Yeah. Sorry, my brain doesn't work right now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
right?
I mean,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
Cool. Can you go on, Cora? Can you say a little bit more, just so I make sure I'm clear with what you're
Yeah,
asking?
I mean, we have like lists of banned words.
Mm-hmm.
We have executive orders that have banned words on our campus recently, right? Like,
right.
So how is the connection between this discursive turn by the right to materiality happening,
Yeah.
right?
Totally. Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not an economic reductionist, so I think there are cultural battles too, right? And we see this around all kinds of stuff, including DEI, trans politics, and so much, right? I mean, and this is the politics of Christianity and belief in these other things that are not totally economically determined. But I think that it's deeply interwoven too, right? Because, you know, these ways of talking, DEI and these kinds of things, have been created by these PMC type people and handled through very bureaucratized PMC type ways, as members of the left have been pointing out forever about this stuff, right? And so I think that I don't want to reduce everything to material, like economic base, but I think that these things are not easily torn apart either, right? Yeah, and so you know, it's not like I definitely am not. You get into a risky place where you're saying like ideas don't have any like repercussions at all. That's silly talk. That's not the way to go with this. I am suspicious of analysis that does not get really deeply materialistic in it, you know, in the way it does things, as a first starter of just understanding like what's the state of the game, who has resources, who has power, and then we can talk about ideas, right? And that kind of stuff. But, you know, I'm really, you know, Daniel Breslau has a wonderful kind of, I don't know if he's going to like me outing him about this, but I'm going to do it anyway. He has this really wonderful like put down. He says, that's not just intellectual history, that's intellectualist history. And we have these, so many histories written today about like neoliberalism. It's like neoliberalism's like Godzilla. It's like a kaiju. Neoliberalism, go around smash. You know, and it's doing all the, it seems to be doing all the acting on its own, right? When I think the reality, and this is why I think the Brenner stuff's interesting, right? About like profitability rates and stuff like that, is that I think that the adoption of neoliberal ideas was in part driven by how the system that was going on before was perceived as failing, right? And so even the adoption of those ideas is very caught up in material change in structures, right? Yeah? Does that, you have other thoughts, or is that, no? All right, well, thank you, I love that question.
Yeah, thankfully, especially for the Godzilla kaiju.
Yes,
example.
That was for you, Yen.
Yeah. I'm. That's just make me thinking about when we would take neoliberalism as a Godzilla, and then maybe we can think about all this critique or this pushback on neoliberalism can be our Shin Ultramans. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. But wonderful talk. So
yeah,
I think it's kind of like remind me many things back in Taiwan, but also in Japan, in South Korea, but also definitely in China, that this kind of recession at different stage, and how can you do regional revitalizations is a, so still in Taiwan and in Japan, people always talk about how can we like rebuild our communities, like find people new jobs, like you share that your hometown transit from steel mill town to like a gambling town with gambling board and present town, and then now it's a warehouse town. So it's kind of like inspiring me about the questions that how do you gonna dealing with like this kind of regional revitalizations or like some kind of grassroots like entrepreneurship revitalizations. At like at the classic 3 level in United States, like you have because I recognize that most of your talk is focused on the federal level. So how about the state level and also or the local or just like how's the local NGO or the community is gonna stay together and bear with this, or we just like dissolve and then there's no hope here. It's kind of like the question. So the question in short is like how do you gonna dealing with this revitalizations or adaptations within this 3 scale?
Yep. So, I mean, I think that I haven't done that homework yet either, but that is very much a part of the picture that I have, and that's why I want to focus on regions in some cases. And like, for instance, the deindustrialization chapter will focus on lots of places, including Joliet, but it'll also focus on the kind of famous deindustrialization town of Youngstown, Ohio, which I have very deep family connections to. And I think that by burrowing down into Youngstown's history, I will be able to uncover what people in Ohio and at the local and regional level were trying to do because that stuff's everywhere, and to your point, right? It's not just the feds. There are reasons for simplified storytelling to kind of stick there a lot, but it just has to come into the picture that there's all these local efforts to do things, most of which, frankly, end in failure, right? They just don't have a lot of success. And so there's time and time again of trying like local development efforts that just kind of end in, build a science park or an innovation campus. And then like, that turned out to be kind of sad, right? So yeah, that's part of the story. But yeah, the efforts are important to note for sure. Yeah.
Hi, Lee. So my question is coming from thinking about you mentioning history and how this could intersect the field of labor history. And I'm particularly interested in, for example, the workers or like how unions play a role here or ways of defending jobs, because it's not only like this kind of like, I mean, I just want to check or to see how do you approach that kind of like role of workers, creating new ways of organization and so on under this context, and about how that's. I'm also curious about the reaction of labor historians to the kind of work that you are proposing as it's coming from this kind of
we'll see.
Observation.
I bet they will be grumpy about something I'll do, I can bet on that. No, I think that the decline of labor power of all sorts, including organized labor, is a big part of the story. And it comes in a variety of different places in the book. But a lot of it, too, and I think that some people miss this, including maybe like Perry Anderson in a recent essay, is that I think a lot of the decline of labor power is more driven by sectoral shifts and growth and change than it is by just the collapse of old industries that were unionized. It's like the labor historian Nelson Lichtenstein, who, I don't know, is a friend or mentor of mine, something like that. He's writing a book on like I think it's called Why Unions Matter. And, he writes about just how hard it is to unionize Starbucks. It's just so different than unionizing like a central, huge capital system like a factory, because you have a bunch of different locations. There's extremely high turnover in that industry, so most people are there for like less than 8 months. So there are structural reasons why it's hard to use those old mechanisms that were so successful and important in the mid-20th century for generating prosperity for so many people, right? And so that's definitely a part of the story. I'm sure labor historians will want me to make it the story, because that's usually what they like to do, is make the thing 100% about the decline of labor power. I don't think it's the only factor. I think there's a lot more going on. But I do think it's an important part of the story. Yeah, for sure.
Hey, Richard, can we go to Rebecca online? I think she wants to.
I'm going to ask Rebecca's question. She submitted in the chat. She said, Lee, thanks for this. I'm curious about why you start with Reich and not Gary Becker and the Chicago School to discuss the rise in focus on human capital. Foucault talks about the focus on human capital as neoliberal governmentality, but traces it to German ordoliberalism. I'm curious about how you fit this longer economic history into your story.
Yeah, so I mean, I probably need to look into this more, but my sense of things, Rebecca, is that Reich's writings on human capital are not coming from the Chicago School. They're coming from a different version of human capital theory that goes back to the late 50s and early 60s and is rooted in thinking about things like secular stagnation and technological unemployment and things like that, including the civil rights movement. But it's an older version, not the Chicago School version. And then it gets updated in a different version of this talk. I talk more about this in the late 1980s by Paul Romer, the economist who wrote a book something about endogenous change. And it's a picture wherein better human capital at an aggregate level leads to more innovation, which leads to more economic growth, and everything else that's beautiful and good, right? And so Reich is probably being influenced by that economic thinking, which is less to do with the Chicago School ordoliberal tradition. That's my sense of things. It could be more mixed up and I might be wrong, but so far reading the intellectual history, that's the way I see things. And the other thing is that this is where the term neoliberal gets so confusing, is because what is neoliberalism and what role does the state play in neoliberalism? Reich is influenced by Japan and West Germany in the 1970s, which are governments that are making pretty significant interventions in the market. And he sees it as not Reaganism. It's not Friedman. Those are the people he hates and is beating up on all the time. It is a different tradition of thinking that exists in the Democratic Party that sometimes is very smoochy with honest-to-God neoliberalism and involves privatizing the internet and doing all other kinds of things in the 1990s. But I think there are multiple threads in the Democratic tradition that include these kind of big state investment visions of how to improve society. So is that neoliberalism in a Hayekian Friedman way? It doesn't sound like it to me, but then it gets into how do we define this stuff, And I decided after writing a couple versions of an essay, this Reich essay, where I kept trying to deal with the neoliberal thing, I'm like, I just don't want to deal with this anymore, Because there's so many different definitions of it that are unstable and everyone's got their axe to grind with it. I'm like, don't think this is super productive, gang, is where I've kind of gotten with things.
My question, Lee, may fit in with your last comments. You pointed out that the Reemployment Act of 1994 never became law.
Yeah.
So what forces aligned to defeat that?
Okay. Yeah,
act?
thank you. And this is a really, probably should have said this, but I mean, there's a really good literature on the Clinton White House now, and I think the best book we have is Nelson Lichtenstein and Judith Stein's recent book on the Clinton White House. It's really very good. And you know what what Lichtenstein shows in that book, and also comes out in the Reich memoirs, is that the concern over government debt amongst the kind of bankers and the finance side of the White House really tamped down any ability to do to put a lot of money into social programs. There was an intense concern around the debt, and so a lot of the more progressive sides of the Clinton agenda just died, basically. And Clinton, apparently, this is what Reich says in his memoirs, was like screaming in his office about it. Because he was so upset. He felt like he had promised the people that he cared about that he was going to do all these things, but he really felt hemmed in by this concern over debt because, you know, he and Gore, I think, ran on a promise of not letting debt get out of control and maybe even reducing it or something like that. I forget that detail. But so, you know, and then, you know, again, we can ask if that's neoliberalism or not, but there's also much longer traditions of kind of fiscal conservatism in the United States that kind of don't mesh well with, like, you know, the Austrian economists and stuff like that, you know. And so, and look, we're about to have another debt discussion. We are currently having another debt discussion in this nation. It's being covered in the Financial Times at least once a week. And so again, in some ways, this stuff just doesn't go away, right? But that's what really shaped things. There's a wonderful moment in Reich's memoirs that he writes as a play. And it's a play happening around in the Oval Office or whatever, you know, like it's all the secretaries around a table talking to Clinton. And basically it's him and someone else that were pushing the progressive policies, and then all the finance hawks like pushing back. And sometimes Clinton looks like he's going to go for the progressive policies and just go for it anyway. And then the ghost of Alan Greenspan appears over the table. And it's like, whoa, you know, if you keep things under control, I will keep interest rates low and keep the economy growing, you know? And that's kind of how Reich renders this, you know, the forces in the White House that were kind of shaping things. Yeah.
Hi, Lee.
Yeah, hi.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm just thinking about the actual international relationships of the U.S. To be exactly with Mexico, because it is where I came from.
Yeah.
So, and now, like the discourse about the tariffs and how this can affect U.S. or Mexico.
Yeah.
And also, there is a discourse in Claudia Sheinbaum. She says that Mexico has like a privilege meetings with secretaries in Washington D.C. And like has this discourse about how Mexico is like a privileged country with this kind of meetings with the presidency of the U.S. And well, this is like just to have these kinds of things in mind. But my question is more about in the history of the U.S. What is the position of the other countries for the same jobs created here in the U.S.
Yeah.
How this affect also like these international relationships. And I don't know also if you have like a certain position about this tariffs politics of the U.S.
The tariffs politics?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I think that in the 70s and 80s, and even before that with the rise of the maquiladora system, all right? There are decisions being made in the United States to create these deep industrial relationships with Mexico in all kinds of ways. And there's American firms down there building factories and stuff. But then in the 80s and into the early 90s, you get a speed up of that stuff. And that's where you get movies like the Michael Moore movie about Flint. Roger and Me, thank you. And you know, what happened there is that GM closed a factory in Flint, Michigan, which later becomes the place of the famous lead water crisis. But they leave and they close down thousands of jobs and they take those factories to Mexico, right? And so in that moment of what I'm calling the remaking the American corporation is a moment where that stuff gets like exploded that much more. And then of course Asia comes into it too, right? And you know, then there's other kinds of, I mean, you just have to be careful like what industry and sector you're talking about. Because I mean, think about agriculture, right? I mean, that relationship is deep and old and has been going on forever, right? And so I think we have to be very, you know, be very detailed about. But yeah, I mean, I think that this book will only very lightly touch on kind of foreign relations when that kind of comes up in my story as like in my face. Let me give you an example. You know, people, what we love to write about kind of Ronald Reagan, the neoliberal free market guy, right? And I get that. I love to write about that guy too. He has like red horns on his head and like, I get it. You know, I like writing about that stuff. But there's also the interesting like Ronald Reagan, who's like a protectionist and creates like import quotas with Japan and also does a lot of military Keynesianism, right? Is spending a lot, billions and billions of dollars on the military. So much so that David Stockman and like real neoliberals were very angry with him actually, right? And so that is like the Japan moment and the way we you know, put import limits on like motorcycles as an example is something I'll be talking about. And that involves kind of foreign relations debate, you know, discussions and stuff like that. You know, my favorite story about the one thing I've heard, I've never written this article and tracked it down, but you know the crotch rocket motorcycle, like the motorcycle you bend over? Apparently, the way that category was created in the United States is because Reagan's import quotas basically killed Asian motorcycles that looked like Harleys, but they could import these things because they were built differently, and so it just created this entire class of vehicles, but it was all to do with like tariffs and stuff. Oh, and then like, look, I want to say this. You know, I've had friends like friends in Appalachian Studies who in the first Trump administration were asking for tariffs because they think that globalization has really screwed over their communities and that this is a tool for rebuilding those industries. I think we need to recognize that, and I also think we need to be real about what this neo-industrial policy that people like Orrin Cass and Vance and all these dudes are into, and what that could do about building some new factories and creating new jobs. But my instinct on this, to be real, is that it's not going to create enough new jobs and growth and all the stuff they're promising to justify the pain that the tariffs are going to cause, which I think are going to end up being a tax on poor people, basically. I think they're a regressive tax. So I'm not opposed to tariffs altogether. I think maybe you should use them sometimes, but the ones that are being kind of thrown out right now, they don't make a lot of sense to me. Yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Lee, thanks for the talk and your intellectual biography. So I have a question that you can take as seriously or unseriously as you want to.
Yeah.
But it strikes me, why is the UCLA history department so cool?
Why are they? Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, so I do focus on a lot of thinkers in the UCLA history department that Jesse got a PhD from, by the way. It have been very important for my thinking. And that includes the Marxists like Perry Anderson and Robert Brenner, especially Robert Brenner. Perry, I'm starting to have, as he ages, I'm starting to diverge from him or something. I don't know those guys at all. They've just been very formative on my thinking. And then your doctoral advisor, who is also the doctoral advisor of my dear friend, Eric Hountschel, who's like my closest intellectual friend, probably these days. is a very fascinating materialist thinker, and including doing wonderful discourse analysis, but doing it in a super materialistic way, including in this book where he writes about this German village in the 18th or 17th, 18th centuries. He writes about discourses of the slurs that husbands and wives would use against each other. They did very tight statistical analysis of the put-downs they would use and how that was tied to changes in how the work that was going on in the home. And so, yeah, I just like that stuff is my jam, you know, like that's what I love.
Don't forget Aaron Beninoff.
Right, that's true.
Who's a student of Brenner.
Yeah.
And was my year.
Okay, yeah, Aaron Beninoff, his book, Automation and the Future of Work, which Sav has also written about, is very, you know, I think Aaron's one of the best thinkers, or that book is such a nice summation of how computers were promised to do so much, to give so much benefit, but they just haven't, right? And I have theories about why that is. I think there's lots of factors there too. I was supposed to deliver a talk on this called Accounting for Computing for a conference, and then my family got the flu. So I'd never given that talk, but it's something I think about a lot. And I think Beninoff's a great, and his future work is going to be good too. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Lee, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you all for the great questions from both online and in person. We'll see you guys this week. We have a presentation by Panita. I think it's a dissertation presentation.
Yeah, please be that. That's my student, Panita,
Yeah.
who I'm very, very proud of. She just got in from Thailand like yesterday, I think.
Okay.
And I will see her for the first time on Monday. So please come next Friday to learn about her beautiful project about how the Thai nation adopted satellite technology for education purposes. It's a really great dissertation.
Okay. Thank you all so much, and see you next week then.